The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to our webinar on redefining the role of business and sport. How can they join forces to accelerate low-carbon technologies across different sectors? I'm Melina Diamatopoulou, Head of Production at Climate Action, and thank you all for joining us. It's a pleasure to welcome so many listeners to our webinar, a testament to the excellent speakers we have participating and sharing their thoughts and experiences in this important topic. Please be aware that this session is being recorded and a link will be emailed to you shortly after the webinar is complete, so you will be able to listen to it again and share it with your peers. Before we start, a few words about climate action. For the last 10 years, we have worked in a unique partnership with the United Nations Environment to develop their official publication and events with the aim to establish partnerships between the public and private sector to accelerate international sustainable development and advance the green economy. Today's webinar takes place ahead of the third Sustainable Innovation in Sport Forum, the only high-level European meeting to bring together stakeholders and influencers innovating in the sport sustainability sector. The forum takes place at the Amsterdam Arena on the 2nd and 3rd of May and brings together more than 250 representatives from the sports leagues and clubs, federations, sports venues, broadcasters, government, the UN, private organizations and NGOs to discuss how the sport industry can inspire and encourage for the fight against climate change. For more information on the speakers and the forum and how to register, please visit our website on www.sustainableinnovationinsport.org. Which brings me to today's webinar on redefining the role of business and sport. Climate change is one of the greatest challenges facing our society, already affecting natural environments and people around the world. Many of the technical solutions needed already exist, and the challenge lies in getting these implemented faster, more broadly, and at scale. For climate action to gain momentum and reach scale with global impact, collaboration across different stakeholder groups and value chains are required. The Paris Agreement has set the framework, however, to drive rapid response and prepare sectors, voluntary actions within and alongside the nationally determined contributions need to be part of the solution. Today's webinar will highlight examples of proven collaborations that lead to tangible climate action, discuss approaches to overcome barriers in the introduction of lower carbon solutions and decarbonisation of value chains, as well as describe how voluntary, economically viable approaches can support the Paris Agreement. I feel extremely privileged to welcome three excellent speakers to address this topic. And without further ado, I would like to welcome and introduce Michel Lemaitre, Head of Sustainability of the International Olympic Committee. In this position, Michel has overseen the recent development of the IOC sustainability strategy and is responsible for its future implementation across the IOC administration, the Olympic Games, and the Olympic movement. Michel has extensive expertise in event management and operations with more than 20 years of professional experience in the area. Her background combines recognized educational knowledge with a successful hands-on experience of implementing event management procedures across an extensive range of sporting and non-sporting events, both large and small. She has been also involved with the Paris 2003 World Athletic Championships and the organizing committee for the Sydney 2000 Olympic Games. I would also like to welcome Sergei Belyavsky, Technology and Sustainability Leader for Dow Olympic Sport and Solutions. Sergei develops and leads programs that combine the power of technology and sport to accelerate market transformation and to catalyze action on climate change. He has been a key contributor to Dow's carbon partnerships with Rio 2016 and Sochi 2014 organizing committees that left a legacy of economically viable and diverse greenhouse gas emissions projects in Brazil, Russia, and beyond. These unprecedented programs already resulted in 2.8 million tons of carbon benefits and are projected to mitigate 4 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent by 2026. Today, Sergei leads the implementation of the IOC Dow Carbon Partnerships, a game-changing collaboration where Dow, as the official carbon partner of the IOC, engages influencers, customers, and value chains in projects that advance a low-carbon future. He believes that innovation, science, and collaboration can provide solutions to the world's most pressing environmental challenges and aspires to contribute to a more sustainable planet and society. Sergei has been with Dow since 2004. And last but not least, I would also like to welcome Jeff Swartz, Director of Climate Policy and Carbon Markets in the South Pole Group, one of the world's leading premium emission reduction project developer. The South Pole Group was named Best Project Developer in Environmental Finance's Voluntary Carbon Market Survey 2011-2014. Jeff's role is to expand South Pole Group's services on climate policy and carbon markets and contribute to the further growth of the company's public advisory and carbon credit offering. Prior to this role, Jeff was a managing director at the International Emissions Trading Association, where he was key to growing new carbon markets and helping to secure Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. Each speaker will take a few minutes to present their views, following which we will take questions from our listeners. You can submit your questions via Twitter using the hashtag CIS2018 or using the question box on the GoToWebinar bar to the right of your screen. Don't be shy, we will try to get through as many relevant questions as possible in the hour time frame. And with that, I shall hand over to our first speaker, Michelle. Hi, Michelle. You also have control of the screen, and we're very much looking forward to your presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Melina. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to speak with you and everyone who's listening today. As you said, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. So I will start my presentation. Let me just see how we do this. Melina, could you take over? Oh, here we go. Thank you very much. Okay, so as Melina said, my name is Michelle Lemaitre. I'm Head of Sustainability at the IOC and responsible for the implementation of the recently approved IOC Sustainability Strategy. Okay. Some of you may have already heard of Olympic Agenda 2020. It's the IOC's strategic roadmap that was approved end 2014. The Olympic Agenda 2020, as you will see on this slide, has three primary pillars: credibility, sustainability, and youth. The Olympic Agenda 2020 is comprised of 40 recommendations. Could you just move to the next slide, please, Melina? Thank you. 40 recommendations. The majority of them touch on sustainability through various aspects. There are two of them, however, the ones listed here, that are specifically related to sustainability. So recommendation 4 includes sustainability in all aspects of the Olympic Games. Recommendation number 5 includes sustainability in the Olympic movement and the IOC's daily operations. So for us to be able to comprehensively respond to those recommendations, we developed our IOC sustainability strategy. This was a period that took approximately 18 months and, as I said previously, was approved end 2016. This is the framework of our sustainability strategy. As you can see, we have 3 spheres of responsibility. The IOC as an organisation, which means our operations here in Lausanne and Madrid, Spain, where we have other offices. IOC as owner of the Olympic Games, and IOC as leader of the Olympic movement. We have 5 focus areas which are relevant to all 3 spheres of responsibility. As you can see here, infrastructure and natural sites, sourcing and resource management, mobility, workforce, and climate. Initially, we had the first 4 focus areas, and we thought that climate was, of course, it's a very important aspect, but it was embedded across the other 4. However, through discussion, thinking about it, we realized that it is such an important area that we singled it out, and it is now the fifth of our focus areas. With our sustainability strategy, there are 2 timeframes. The first one being 2030, which illustrates the forward and long-term thinking of sustainability. And it's also in line with the United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Goals. As you can see, we have strategic intents for our 3 spheres of responsibility. The second time frame is 2020. Just waiting for the slide to come up. Thank you. The second time frame is 2020. This, of course, is a lot forward-looking, a lot closer-looking in time frame. Once again, we have objectives for our 3 areas of responsibility, and we also have defined objectives per sphere of responsibility. So as you can see, there are 9 for the IOC as an organisation, 4 as owner of the Olympic Games, and 5 as leader of the Olympic movement. 2020 was also selected because it's aligned with our Olympic Agenda 2020, and the IOC operates in 4-year cycles. So the IOC as an organisation, as I said, we have 9 objectives. The first one, okay, we'll go through them all like this. As you'll see, first one is in line with infrastructure and natural sites. This is particularly important at the moment because we are currently building a new headquarters here in Lausanne. Second one is sustainability and the sourcing of goods and services, and also our objective to achieve measurable reduction in waste quantities. Next one, thank you. Number 5 is mobility, and it's our objective to reduce our travel impacts. Number 6 and 7 are related to workforce, and here we want to increase staff diversity, and we also want to develop a healthy and active lifestyles of the IOC. And most importantly for today is number 8, which is achieve carbon neutrality by reducing direct and indirect greenhouse gas emissions. And this, of course, is what we'll talk about a bit later and in more detail, the relationship between IOC and DAO. Number 9 is include sustainability into our corporate events. So the next one is the Olympic Games, and here it is IOC as owner of the Olympic Games. We have 4 objectives. Number 13, as you will see, is actually calling for strategic partnerships to develop innovative, sustainable solutions. And here, the IOC and DAO carbon mitigation program is an excellent example of how this is actually being addressed. By combining the scope and global visibility of the IOC with the innovative technical expertise of DAO to address global issues of climate change and address our objectives of carbon neutrality at the same time. The next one, which is the Olympic movement, here we have 5 objectives. When we're talking about the Olympic movement, we are talking primarily of the international federations on the Olympic program, of which there are 35, including winter and summer, and currently 206 national Olympic committees based across the 5 continents. So here, this sphere highlights the IOC's extended global reach and its role to provide support and education. And here, the IOC and the DAO program is totally aligned with this concept. It not only mitigates our carbon emissions, but it also provides extended societal impacts and hopefully legacy opportunities. So, although, if we can move to the next one, sorry. So here I put together just some facts and figures to illustrate the scope of the Olympic Games. And although it is huge, we have a huge scope, as you can see. London, there we're talking about 10,500 athletes and 8.8 million tickets sold. Sochi, the Winter Games, with 2,700 athletes and more than 1.1 million tickets sold, and Rio 2016 with approximately 11,300 athletes and more than 6 million tickets sold. They have a huge scope, but they're not all that we do. These are not the only thing that the IOC actually does. The next slide, thank you. As indicated here, like the IOC Dow Carbon Mitigation Program, the Olympic Games are not only what we do. We do a lot more than the Olympic Games. As reflected in the list of the IOC programs here, the goal of the Olympic movement is to contribute to building a peaceful and better world by educating youth through sport practice without discrimination of any kind in the Olympic spirit. The IOC and Dow Carbon Mitigation Program also goes beyond the scope of the Games, of the Olympic Games, to have a more global footprint. As I said, it not only mitigates carbon emissions, but also provides societal impacts and future opportunities. And these concepts are really important to the IOC and totally aligned with our objectives. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Michelle. Thank you for the very interesting presentation. We can now move on to Sergey. Hi, Sergey.
Hi, Melina.
Brilliant. So you also have control of the mouse. Do let me know if you have any issues with the slides, and I can help you with that, of course. But we look forward to your presentation.
Thanks so much, and thanks, Michelle, for your part of the presentation. It's a joy. We're happy to work together with you as a top Olympic partner, and now as your official carbon partner. So in my part of today's webinar, I will talk about those carbon mitigation capability, different applications where we work for this partnership, and provide examples of some actual projects that we put in place for the past programs. So I'll start with the journey towards this partnership. I can see the slide changing. So this is a proven capability that we have successfully deployed during the Sochi and then Rio Olympic Games. Working with the IOC, working with the organizing committees, and to date, we're speaking about 11 mitigation projects in more than 7 countries, I guess, that delivered 2.8 million tons of CO2. And if we project this project, the forecast till 2026, while we monitor them, this will amount to 4 million tons of carbon benefits. And so we used this experience, we used the knowledge that we obtained to forge a new partnership now with the IOC. And that partnership, again, has a basis those climate solutions framework for events as a methodology. However, now it is games agnostic, if I may say. Yeah, so it's complementary to games carbon mitigation activities, and this is a partnership that now happens globally and has global relevance beyond the world of sports. So on one side, to make a sensible program, the IOC's part is to monitor, to measure their footprints, their impacts as an organization, as Michelle said, and their part would be to look at reduction measures, yeah, so where these impacts can be reduced. And Dow's part in this partnership is to mitigate the rest with technology-enabled projects. Obviously, the carbon benefits from these projects, as in previous programs, will be verified by independent third party, and we have the concept of additionality, concept of beyond business as usual as the cornerstone of this program. So more towards the projects and what they are. Again, our methodology is based on best principles of carbon accounting of the world, we work with our customers, we work with those value chains to accelerate technologies that are better than incumbent, that optimize energy efficiency, that make buildings better insulated, that make packaging lighter and better performing, and so on. So always we are speaking about an improvement versus existing practices or about or versus a code. And in order to accelerate these technologies, we are using the Olympic brand, we are using our designation as an official carbon partner to achieve engagement of the value chain. So even though this is a global program and a global effort, we are always thinking locally and acting locally on projects and looking at quantifying not only and looking not only at carbon benefits, but also at the legacy of the project in a more societal way. So for the project implementation period, we're looking until 2020. So this is when all the activities that we want to put in place will need to be accomplished. And we're looking at again at 2026 as the period till when we will monitor the climate benefits. Speaking of technologies that we will use and are using, Dow is a global leader in material science, so we have solutions and technologies across a variety of applications. Important that anything that we are using in this program are existing technologies or something that just came out of R&D pipeline. And Dow acts as a technology enabler. However, every time we are speaking about interacting with value chains. For instance, we are looking at projects for what we call built environments. So how can we make buildings perform better? How can we enhance the thermal performance via improving facade insulation, introducing state-of-the-art silicon technologies for facades, for instance, or if we look at non-glass, at opaque part of buildings, how can we enhance insulation? So polyurethane technologies and other types of insulation. And we are looking at industrial efficiency, typically high energy consuming processes that where by tweaking the technology, by using smart chemistry and state-of-the-art approaches, we can reduce this energy use and achieve significant benefits. We are, as a world's leader in packaging technologies, of course, we are looking at this application, and there are many things that can be done there to make the food last longer, reduce waste of food, reduce waste during transportation, and then the packaging itself, how can we make it lighter or better recyclable while enhancing the functions of having better performed packaging. Yeah, so these are really our three key applications. And before I move next, I wanted to mention, I said technologies already exist, and every project that we implement, it needs to make economical sense for Dow and for our customers. So these are economically viable solutions. So the question might be, if that is so, if these technologies are so good that they make commercial sense, why are not they implemented automatically? Why does not it happen by itself? And well, it does not. There are numerous barriers that exist, barriers such as lack of awareness or not enough engagement, customs, inertia, organizations or individuals being risk averse. There are perceived financial barriers that people think need to be overcome. So our project is actually about removing all these barriers using the Olympic brand and also using science. Yeah, so this is where sport and science come together to enable change. So I'll illustrate this with some examples from projects from Russia and Brazil. For instance, in Russia, in the run-up to Sochi 2014 Olympic Winter Games, we had a campaign with our customer that manufactures insulating foam. Obviously, Russia cold climate, enhancing thermal performance of buildings, especially windows, is one of the good ways to reduce energy use. This is where we looked for this program, and we had a combination with by working with window companies and also home owners to talk about climate change, to promote measures that reduce energy use at households and also energy bills. We made 100,000 cans of foam available for free to homeowners to incentivize window replacement. Something a radical, the main measure a homeowner in Russia could take to make their home warmer. And so alongside that, we looked at the industrial part here, so how the foam is manufactured, and tailored the polyurethane system in a way that it could work with another blowing agent that has significantly lower global warming potential. So a project that combined the industrial efficiency part and also the insulation part. Quite successful, quite impactful, a good legacy in Russia that we are still proud of. And then another example from another part of the world, and another games, Rio 2016. There we had a project in the range and pasture application. So here, land and erosion degradation of pasture is a big problem, not only in Brazil, but worldwide. And there are ways, there are technologies to recover this land and in the same time have the range activities much more efficient. So instead of exploring new lands when farmers need to intensify, they could recover and use existing lands. So this is exactly where we had our efforts directed to, a team of professionals on the ground today, probably now working on the ground, to educate farmers of these techniques and methods to intensify production and have their land sequester more carbon. So a great project where we actually expect possibly to be able to verify the first results, first carbon already this year. So with that, we'll end my part and give the floor to Jeff to speak about voluntary program. So what you heard about the partnership between Dow and the IOC is an example of voluntary programs. So Jeff can talk about how these can be important for our battle with climate change.
Excellent.
Thank you. Floor to you, Jeff.
Thank you, Sergey. Jeff, can you hear us all right?
Yes, thank you very much.
Brilliant. And you should be able to have control of the slides right now as well.
I do, thank you. And thank you, Sergey, for that introduction. So I'm going to be speaking to you all a little bit about the implementation of the Paris Agreement and how voluntary programs and activities can help meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, and specifically how the Dow and Olympic Partnership is doing that. So just a moment on the company I work for, South Pole. We are a company of over 10 years. We have developed numerous amounts of projects that have cumulatively reduced over 80 million tons of CO2 emissions. That's around the annual national greenhouse gas emissions of Greece. We're also very involved in renewable energy. We've enabled the production of more than 100,000 gigawatts of renewable energy, and that's around the annual electricity consumption of the Netherlands. And we're also very, very focused on quantifying non-CO2 or non-energy benefits. So the type of activities that we engage in, we also try to ensure always that there are high co-benefits for communities, for biodiversity, and also for other types of impacts such as water and clean energy. So we now know that the Paris Agreement has completely entered into force, and there are a number of countries which have setting forward their own what are called nationally determined contributions, and these are basically climate blueprints for how governments intend to move towards a 2-degree world. And we also know that collectively governments need to work together in order for the Paris Agreement to be effective. But even if the Paris Agreement has now entered into force and governments are putting in place these plans, there are still a number of both physical and transitional risks that come with climate change. So despite action by government, we're still going to face a number of different risks. And those are physical risks to our communities, to our buildings that we work in. They are also transitional risks. So in the future, it might be harder for companies to operate as a result of natural disasters or issues related to not having enough natural resources at hand. There are risks to companies around new regulations that come with the implementation of the Paris Agreement and also with societal change. So while the Paris Agreement has entered into force, companies and communities face quite a lot of risks, nevertheless. Despite the tremendous success that we have with the Paris Agreement now entering into force, there's still a huge gap when it comes to implementation. And there is an enormous gap in global infrastructure investments. We know that if we are going to move towards a world where we are more resilient with climate change and we're moving towards a 2-degree world, we have a gap in global infrastructure investments of around $1 trillion per year, and this figure is growing according to economists. We know that only 4% of the largest 500 cities in the developing world are creditworthy in international markets, and therefore these cities are going to face the greatest amount of challenges when it comes to energy efficiency and buildings and new mobility policies and transportations. And we also know that over $5 trillion is needed until 2020 for clean energy alone. So all of that is to say that the private sector and individuals in the greater economy have to also step up if we're serious about moving towards a world where we stabilize temperature increase at 2 degrees or below. We cannot rely on government intervention alone. And so here I'd like to explain you a few examples of how voluntary action can help meet the 2-degree challenge. So voluntary standards and programs are basically about identifying, quantifying, and financing emission reductions and adaptation impacts to assist governments meet these nationally determined contributions. And they also, at the same time, help companies work towards and achieve climate neutral goals. So it all starts with companies who decide on their own if they want to put forward a voluntary program or implement a voluntary standard that can help them quantify and reduce CO2 emissions or other impacts such as clean energy, water, and biodiversity. Voluntary programs are important because they help governments implement policies. They also help governments identify new areas where emissions reductions can take place, and that can, in the future, ignite new policies for governments to pass when it comes towards quantifying and reducing CO2 emissions. we anticipate that there'll probably be more voluntary opportunities in countries that are in the emerging economy. So countries who have put forward plans under the Paris Agreement that are not economy-wide. I'm speaking to you today from London. And in London and here in the UK, we have an economy-wide emission reduction target. But recently I was traveling in Southeast Asia, and many countries in Southeast Asia do not have economy-wide emission reduction targets. And therefore, the emission reduction targets that governments might pass and implement to meet the challenges of the Paris Agreement and help implement their nationally determined contributions will not cover the entire economy. And that is a clear opportunity for the private sector to step up and implement voluntary action. And I think I've said this already to you today before, but voluntary standards and actions can also look at other impacts such as water, biodiversity, gender impacts, and health. So here are a few examples of how companies and other organizations can set up voluntary action programs. Companies can pass what are called climate neutrality goals, where the CO2 emissions of a particular product or service can be compensated by an investment in an emission reduction project on the site of the company itself, or in the surrounding community, or the surrounding region, or internationally. So companies adopt a climate neutrality goal, they quantify their own carbon footprint, and then they go out and look for ways to reduce it. Companies and organizations can also adopt renewable energy goals. So this helps them access renewable energy exclusively and shift the money that they spend on power and electricity away from traditional fossil fuels and towards clean renewable energy such as solar, wind, or biogas. And one way of doing that is by going out and purchasing what are called renewable energy certificates. These are country specific, and they are represented in activities that are renewable energy generation, which is connected to our energy grid. And another example is calculating an organization's carbon footprint and then assessing within that footprint where gains can be made in the supply chains of a company's product or an organization's activities. So these are three examples of voluntary action that companies and organizations are taking all the time. And I'll now talk to you briefly about the cooperation that South Pole is performing with Dow and the International Olympic Committee's Carbon Partnership. So as was mentioned earlier in the webinar, the International Olympic Committee and Dow are working on a carbon partnership for the Olympics. And at the core of this partnership is an innovative global climate change mitigation program to help reduce the operations of the International Olympic Committee and also to identify ways to mitigate climate change in Dow's activities. So South Pole is supporting this partnership by looking for the potential of emissions reductions in specific new and innovative building technologies. So we're building up a knowledge base that understands the regional differences in building codes and regulations, as well as the building energy efficiency baselines and the obstacles and barriers when it comes to implementing these new energy saving technologies. And this is a voluntary program and a voluntary standard that Dow has taken on as an organization. And through this investigation, we're developing what are called project design documents to specifically account for the emissions reductions which will be saved in these new building energy efficiency technologies. And we're looking specifically ahead at future Olympic Games as well as future sporting activities where these technologies can be implemented. And as part of this, we're developing a tool that calculates the emissions reductions which are achieved with these technologies by applying to different building facade technology solutions in the high-rise building sector. So the high-rise building sector genuinely has a larger CO2 footprint, and that's why we're looking specifically at these technological solutions. This tool is based on a building simulation model, which allows to identify the assessment of the emission reduction potential in specific cities and specific regions using specific building technologies. So this is quite innovative stuff. It's not just putting up a new building somewhere in some part of the world. It's looking specifically at the whole footprint of the building and the building supply chain, and then looking clearly at what kind of technologies can be implemented that save energy over the life cycle of the building. And the tool is being used today to identify opportunities and also to convince the building developers to use these technologies when they make decisions about the thermal performance of their projects. And based on this tool, we will be able to engage third parties to validate the emissions that are saved and the energy saved in these new buildings using Dow's technologies. And all of these buildings will be quantified and will be used in the future with these new technologies. So this is a clear collaboration between South Pole, Dow, and the IOC, which is putting in place a new voluntary program specifically looking at that global infrastructure financing gap where we need to save energy in our cities if we're serious about moving towards a 2-degree future. So I thank you for the opportunity to present today, and I'll hand it back to you, Melina. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeff, for the very interesting presentation and for complementing the presentations of Sergey and Michelle and speaking about the very interesting project. At this stage, before we move very quickly to the Q&A part of the webinar today, I would like to invite Sergey. I know you have a few final remarks to make around the partnership with the IOC as well.
Right. Thanks, Melina, and thanks, Jeff and South Pole Group for the partnership. In conclusion, I would like to once again emphasize the importance of collaboration for programs like this and the importance of mutual benefit. Here we are really achieving together something that organizations like ours wouldn't be able to achieve on our own. And so, for instance, for Dow and our customers, this program makes totally business sense. Yeah, we are growing markets, we are growing our brand differentiation through sport while we accelerate adoption of our technologies. Then from the environmental perspective and also the IOC, this partnership leads to more widespread application of solutions and processes that lower greenhouse gas emission reductions throughout the whole life cycle of these materials. And then for a society, we're building momentum towards better technology, momentum that advances the transition to the lower carbon future, as we say. So with that, we'd like to thank the audience for your attention, and we would be happy to receive questions.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Sergey. And I am now unmuting both Michelle and Jeff, so we can move on to the questions and answers part of the webinar. Very quickly, I would like to also remind to our listeners that if you have any questions that you haven't sent through yet, there is a question box at the webinar software at the right of your screen. Please use the question box to send us your questions. And without further ado, I think there's relatively different aspects of that the questions we've received are touching on. So to start with, I guess transportation is quite a huge topic. It's not necessarily questions we have received, but statements. But I think it's very, very interesting because from our side, from the climate action side, we also speak to the industry quite a lot. We have been putting together the Sustainable Innovation in Sport Forum for 3 years now. And this is obviously an issue that it needs to be tackled. It is very openly discussed with between all of our speakers, and they all have initiatives trying to kind of mitigate emissions triggered by transportation. So we do have the generic question, I guess, and it has come through a few different people. Is obviously for sports, the teams, the equipment, it needs to be, it needs to fly around the world in a way. So, what does the IOC advise, or what is your position around how to mitigate the emissions that come from all those flights?
Mm-hmm. It is a very good question, and it's a question that we ask ourselves quite regularly, because as the people who have provided you with those comments realised, sport, like other event groups, travel. There are events that can be watched, by not travelling or whatever, but sport events do incite travel, either through, of course, the athletes attending, the media covering the events, the spectators wanting to be in the venues or part of the celebration sites, etc. So it is a big part of our sustainability strategy. If you remember, it's one of the 5 focus areas of our sustainability strategy: mobility, moving people around the world, and also through freight, equipment, etc. So there's a number of things. The first one, of course, is looking at travel itself and how necessary it is. So I know at the IOC and in many of the Olympic movement's offices themselves, they are conscious of the fact that you don't have to travel to attend every meeting either. There are other options that are becoming more and more viable through Skype, through webinars, through video conferences, etc., etc. So that's something that we are definitely leveraging. It's also looking at how the sport travels around the world as well. And I know many of the international federations are trying to reduce travel through looking at where the events are in the world and in their actual event program, so that they're going around the world in one way, in one direction, rather than making smaller or trips sort of back and forth type of thing. I know that is an area as well. Also, people are looking more and more, the federations, the athletes, etc., are looking more and more at airlines that are offering compensation offsets as well. That's becoming I wouldn't say business practice, business as usual, but it is definitely another option that is becoming more and more common.
Great. Thank you, Michelle. Sergey or Jeff, would you have something to add on Michelle's comments on transportation?
Yeah, I would just say that when you look at the numbers, most customers, when they do travel by air, do not compensate the emissions from their flights. So recent studies have suggested that less than 5% of customers actually click the box when they say if they want to offset their flights. So one of the most important things that an organization can do is to have a company-wide travel offsetting policy. These are very easy to pass. It's a specific budget that would have to be allocated, and you can have a policy in your organization where every flight that is taken by an employee is calculated when you do your expense report, and those flights are then at the end of the year compensated through carbon offsets that the company's employees can choose. So usually these kinds of things have to be mandated at an organization's core if they are going to be realistically implemented to reduce the CO2 footprint from taking flights.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Sergey, I'm not sure if you have something to add to this.
No, that's fine. Let's see what the other questions are.
Great. Well, I have a question that maybe more of our attendees will have, but I think it was Jeff that was at his final remarks referring to building up a knowledge base. Forgive me if I'm mistaken. I think it was Jeff. But we have a question. What does this exactly involve? How do you actually build a knowledge base?
Yes, so that was included in my presentation, and I'll speak briefly and also ask Sergey to please comment. So the knowledge base that we're building up is understanding the different regional differences in building codes and regulations, as well as on building policy obstacles and barriers. So we're looking at when new high-rises are created, what are the differences with building codes, what are the differences with building regulations, and what are the differences amongst countries, cities, and regions when it comes to using new technologies that can save energy efficiency. So a lot of times in the building sector, there's no incentive to use new technologies to save energy. It's simply not there in the building code or in the building regulations. And this touches upon what Sergey was saying during his segment of the webinar. So by building up this knowledge base, we're identifying very clearly where the regulations are not there when it comes to having incentives to put in place new building energy efficiency technologies. So when there's a lack of this policy, then there's a window of opportunity for voluntary action using new energy efficiency technologies that Dow has on offer. So that's the type of knowledge base that we're creating.
Thank you. And Sergey, did you want to comment on that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I think Jeff, thanks. And a good example was just recently we have accomplished a study together with South Pole Group looking at China and different parts of China. So where you have a range of climatic zones from extreme hot, let's say in the southern part in Hong Kong and so on, to extreme cold during the winter in the northern part of China. So there are different climatic conditions, and also there are different regional construction norms and codes that we need to take into account. So if we look at a carbon mitigation project from an efficiency perspective, so where do we need to go with our technology, with our improvements to create the most impact? That knowledge base, this is exactly what we need to help us. Like we saw, for instance, that we could maybe improve one building in Harbin or the northern part of China, that the heat energy that it uses is less, versus maybe 15 buildings, I'm making the number up, but something like this in Hong Kong, where we can do similar improvement, but then where we need to cool the building a bit less, but the impacts would be more in the northern part. So that learning is, it came as a relatively a surprise for us. This is what we are doing together with South Pole Group. Now we're looking at different parts of Europe, at climatic conditions, weather during different parts of the year, and construction codes. So is it Middle East, is it Eastern Europe or Northern Europe where our project can make the most impact? And this is where we need research and data and analysis, and this is where South Pole Group gives us a lot of expertise and help.
Excellent. Thank you very much, both. Moving on to a different subject and back to me, Michelle. We have a question around, and Sergey, I assume, but how can eventually IOC and Dow even more support the National Olympic committees? How does this partnership eventually extend to these national bodies?
Sergey, did you want to start?
Well, absolutely. So, as I mentioned, this program is complementary to the activities of specific games, and obviously today, Japan Tokyo 2020 is in our focus. So we are having a discussion. We're looking at opportunities to do specific things in around Tokyo and in Japan that are relevant for the country and for the economy. And should we be able to identify such an opportunity, it can well become not only a part of our program, but also our contribution to the Tokyo Games.
And just to to extrapolate a little bit on that one, is that as indicated in our sustainability strategy, our third sphere is IOC as leader of the Olympic movement. And here we work directly with the national Olympic committees and the international federations to educate them, to inspire them, to provide them with guidance, etc. So here we have started a dialogue on a number of topics with the National Olympic Committees, climate being one of them. And here what we're trying to identify is initiatives that we could support them with. We could sort of take them under our wing and support them, provide them guidance, etc., and enable that particular initiative to be part of the IOC DAO carbon mitigation program.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, both. Again, moving on to a slightly different question. We have a question from a listener if the panelists see any need for scientific research in the field of sport and sustainability in specific. If so, what is your advice? Which specific field would that be? I don't know, would Michelle like to go first, maybe?
Sure. I mean, research across any area I'm all for, definitely. Here, I suppose, I mean, I can't think of anything really specific because sport is like many other areas, as in they travel, they have businesses to operate. They do have sport equipment. Some, of course, have a very specific sport equipment, but it's objects. It's how do you reduce carbon in the fabrication of things in general. Of course, there are areas that are quite specific to sport in regards to climate change and snow and all the related issues that we're all aware of. But a big one, of course, there is the manufacturing of snow, of artificial snow. Of course, that comes back to water sources, etc. But that is an area that could be looked at.
Sergey or Jeff, would you have anything to add?
Yeah, well, of course, the research has been the engine of progress for a long time, at least for the last 200 or 300 of years, and I think it's critical that, and we need to look from the perspective of not only sport, but what are the world challenges. Yeah, this is obvious. The feeding people, the waste, the overpopulation, the resource efficiency, and this is where, for instance, my company Dow is putting a lot of emphasis, and I think we invest over $1 billion every year in research and development to address these global trends. So this program with the IOC is an opportunity for us. It's like a lens, a magnifying glass to highlight these technologies that come out of our R&D pipeline and how they help to address world challenges.
Great, thank you. Jeff?
Well, I'm not the expert in the field of research and sport, especially when it comes to climate change, but I do know that when the Olympics were here in London, the government of the time made a huge effort to make it a quote unquote green games. And when Brazil hosted in 2014, there was a similar effort. And so I think it would be wonderful if we get to a point in the future, perhaps, hopefully, as soon as 2020, when the Olympics go to Tokyo, where we can truly have some kind of a carbon neutral games. How that could be done, I think, will involve a lot of important research on how the games can be more carbon friendly, how newer technologies can be used, and how practices can be implemented to achieve such a lofty goal. And I know the partnership between Dow and the IOC is working towards that and is a real world test case of that. But I think there can be more research done in this space so that when we do have fantastic sports events such as the Olympics, we can also make sure that they're not having such a big impact on the environment.
Excellent.
And if I can just add there, my big objective, my big ambition would be, that we didn't have tags on, green games or sustainable games or whatever, but that just events, Olympic Games it was integrated into it. It becomes business as usual, and we don't have to start using tags to draw attention to things like that.
Great. Thank you very much, everyone. We essentially have a minute time left, but I would like to give the opportunity to the panelists to make some concluding remarks. Before we go to that, I have a very last question, because it's always important for us to ensure that we have all regions really of the world kind of represented and get their questions answered. So I'm not sure if Michelle or somebody else would like to take the question, but we have somebody's asking, in developing countries, the sport business and practice itself, it needs a lot of financial support. Do you have any examples of projects in developing countries that help both reduce emissions but at the same time grow support of sport at the same time?
Off the top of my head, I'm not able to give you any specific details. However, the IOC does provide support to the national Olympic committees in the countries, in developing countries, and a lot of them are, a number of them are environmentally based, sustainable based, and that is actually something that we're seeing more and more of, more requests for support in those areas.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thanks, Michelle, and thank you very much to all three of the panelists as well as the listeners. Sergey, would you like to make any concluding remarks to the webinar today?
Well, probably not much. I would like to thank everyone for attending, and thank you, Melina, for putting it all together and organizing.
Brilliant.
Thanks to my fellow panelists, Michelle and Jeff.
No problem, and thank you very much for organizing Michelle and Jeff to be on the webinar today as well.
A real pleasure. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, everybody. As a reminder, if you are interested to hear more about sustainability and sports, the third Sustainable Innovation in Sport Forum is taking place in about a month from now at the Amsterdam Arena. Please do go to our website, www.sustainableinnovationinsport.org, to find out more information. The webinar has been recorded. You will receive a message with the recording in the next 2 days, so you can hopefully listen to it again and share it with your peers and colleagues. Thank you very much for your time, and we'll see you at our next webinar. Bye-bye.